Greetings and welcome to our church service via Zoom. It's good to be present with you all, and God has answered many prayers, which I want to share with you, not today, but when we meet in Sydney. But today, let us open the Word of God into Acts 22. We're going to talk a bit about the Apostle Paul today. He was one of the great leaders of the church in past times. Let us read in Acts 22 verse 3 about Apostle Paul and his beginning. This is talking about the Apostle Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, but he was also a Jew. It says here, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city, that's at Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. So Paul was born a Jew, should I say, and brought up a Pharisee. And Gamaliel, the great teacher of the Pharisees, he was a religious leader of the Sanhedrin. He taught Paul the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. Paul was well instructed. He was instructed about the various things, instructed about Sabbath keeping. And Jews were only permitted to do certain things on the Sabbath. For instance, they were only permitted to travel about 2,000 cubits on the Sabbath. That was considered a Sabbath day's journey. And in Acts chapter 1, we see that this is mentioned. It says that Acts chapter 1 verse 12, then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is from Jerusalem a Sabbath day's journey. So a Sabbath day's journey for a Jew was about 2,000 cubits, which I equal to about 2/3 of a mile, if you're into miles, or about a kilometre, 1.2 kilometres. It's not far to walk. So this was considered to be a Sabbath day's journey. Any journeying any longer would be considered work. So Paul was well instructed. He knew the Sabbath day rules. I think it also derives from Exodus chapter 16 verse 29, where they went out to gather the manna. There was no manna, and the Lord told them to stay in their places of dwelling, to stay in your places, not to go out wandering around the countryside looking for manna. And so the Jews took that very seriously, to stay within the city limits, if you like, the city limits of Jerusalem, and not to journey further, because that wasn't really, it was considered like a work. So Apostle Paul was well instructed in these things. And he was well instructed. You know, they kept the Sabbath from Friday night sunset until Saturday night sunset. That's how the Jews kept the Sabbath, and people keep it. They keep it even till today. So from Saturday night onwards, they considered that secular time. Those were common working days. And God commanded them. He commanded them to work on those 6 days, Saturday night and Sunday night included, or Sunday, so daylight included. So the Jews attached no sanctity to the hours of Sunday or Saturday night. And so that's what Paul was instructed. That's what he was taught. And let's read in Philippians 3 verse chapter 3, verse 4. About Paul a bit more. About the early days of Paul and how much importance he held with the law of God, the things he was instructed. And he says, though I might have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. So as Pharisees, they would trust the flesh. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. So he was brought up a Pharisee, and keeping the law as a Pharisee. And then concerning zeal, persecuting the church. That was the Christian church. Touching the law, righteousness which is in the law, blameless. So in these verses, we can see that Paul was a very strict Pharisee. Regarding the law, he considered himself blameless. Therefore, he certainly was a strict Sabbath keeper. And like all the Pharisees were, they kept the commandments. And as we read in the commandments, in Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord thy God. So they were commanded to keep it holy and actually commanded to work 6 days. Even after his conversion, the Apostle Paul did not abandon the law of God. It wasn't like he didn't abandon the 10 commandments. Although the Apostle Paul, he realized that all his Pharisaical works, all of these things that he did, he still failed to keep God's law. That was his realization after his conversion. All his human efforts to keep God's law were a failure. He thought himself able as a Pharisee, but after his conversion, he realized that it wasn't adequate with God. His extreme efforts to keep the law were not adequate. In God's eyes, Paul realized he was still a sinner. And his human strength was not enough. The law condemned him and he had a struggle. Let's read in Romans chapter 7. But even after his conversion on the road to Damascus, you see, Paul does not abandon the law of God. Let's read in Romans chapter 7. He had a struggle. He just realized the depth of God's law all the more after his conversion. Let's read it here in Romans chapter 7, verse 7. We want to describe Apostle Paul's experience. It says there, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. So here, Apostle Paul was referring to the 10 Commandments, one of the laws of the 10 Commandments. He says the law is there and it's teaching me. And then here in verse 9, you see, he says, for I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came and sin revived, I died. And the commandment which I was ordained to be life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and it slew me. So when Apostle Paul was a Pharisee, the law was, he thought he kept the law. It was like, yeah, but when the commandment came, when he was converted, he realized the depth of the law. He realized how condemned he was. Even before he felt he was keeping the law, he thought he was righteous as a Pharisee. But then after his conversion, he realized the law was more. And in verse 11, it says, wherefore the law is holy, the commandment holy, just, and good. So you see, Apostle Paul did not abandon the law of God. No, after the realization that he was going the wrong way on the road to Damascus, he was living, he was doing the wrong thing. He was going against the church of Jesus. Paul did not abandon the law of God as irrelevant. Otherwise, he would not have had this struggle. He describes here in Romans chapter 7. He's having a struggle. And the law condemns his lust and his wrong behaviors. It condemned his malice and his passion, his anger that he had against the Christians. And he says that sin is in his members, even here in Romans 7, verse 23. He says, I see another law in my members, that's in his body, warring against the law of my mind. So he's talking about the struggle between the flesh and his mind, the lust that's within him, the passion, the malice he had. It's warring against himself here. So he sees a law in his members, in his body, warring against the law of his mind, bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members, in his body. And then he says, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? And then finally, at the end, he concludes, I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. So with his mind, Paul served the law of God, although he had this battle with the flesh, which we all have. And that's why Apostle Paul says elsewhere that he was constantly at the throne of grace, praying for help to fight that battle, that internal battle. And so this is the battle we all have, and Paul describes it. And there's also so important to take note here that when Apostle Paul said, I serve the law of God with my mind, the higher part of your mind. Paul was meaning the law of God that he was taught from the beginning, the 10 Commandments. That's what Paul is meaning. Not human traditions of the Pharisees, no. The 10 Commandment law that he was taught. The Pharisees were taught that as well. Okay. That is the law he served with his mind. God's law. As even the Jews although they attempted to keep it in their own strength, and that's what they did, and obviously failed. But it is that law. And he says in verse 25 there, this is the law of God, that he wants to keep. The law that's the same law. And as one of the 10 Commandments, indeed, the seventh-day Sabbath, Paul continued to keep this day holy, as he would have. And he continued to keep that part of the commandment, and the part of the commandment which says you should labor 6 days. Paul would have strictly followed this, even after his conversion, giving no sanctity, no holiness to those 6 common working days. Paul would have given no sanctity to them. Sunday included, because there's 10 commandments. Now, some Christians say Paul changed. Did Paul ever give any sanctity or any holiness to the first day of the week or Sunday? And that is the question. Well, let us look at the story of Apostle Paul. Go through in the book of Acts and you'll see. What day did Paul worship on? Did he change? Here in Acts chapter 17, let's read in Acts chapter 17. Did Paul ever give any sanctity to another day? Well, here in chapter 17, verse 1, we read, "Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures." So notice what this says. As Paul's manner was, he went to the synagogue of the Jews and he preached on the Sabbath day. This was his manner. This was his custom. Paul had not changed his manner or custom from the very beginning, which was entrenched with him from the teachings of Gamaliel. There's no indication that he changed his manner any time. Let us read in Acts chapter 18, verse 1. "And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth." Verse 2, "And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and Greeks." So in Corinth, Paul labored weekly, making tents with Aquila and Priscilla. That was a trade of Paul. Working 6 days according to the commandment. But every Sabbath, Paul preached in the synagogue, persuading Jews and Greeks. This was his custom. This was his manner. And then in verse 11, it says, "And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them." So Apostle Paul was there in Corinth for a year and a half. And he stayed there. That would be 78 Sabbaths teaching the word of God. I calculated it. 78 Sabbath days. All the while working 6 days a week, as was commanded by God in the commandment, which Paul was taught from the beginning. Now come to Acts chapter 20 and look what Paul did. This is a bit of a shocker to some people. Acts chapter 20. And I want to read verse 7 there. And it says, "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight." Wow. Paul broke his custom there, preaching on the 7th day Sabbath. Here we find him preaching on the first day of the week. Could this mean that Paul placed sanctity or holiness on the Sunday? And this text is often used to prove Sunday sacredness, that the Apostle Paul and the early Christians were gathering there and they counted it a holy day to worship on the Sunday. Well, let's read the whole story to find out in context, and you'll see the picture. Let's read the whole story. It's important. Let's read here in Acts chapter 20, verse 4. From there down, the whole story to verse 16. And it says, "And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus of Asia, and Tychicus and Trophimus." So these are all the companions of Paul, a bunch of people. "And these going before tarried for us at Troas. So they're going to Troas, and we sailed away to Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. Okay. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered. And there sat in the window a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he sunk down with sleep and fell down from the third loft and was taken up dead. It was a long night of preaching. And Paul went down and fell on him and embraced him and said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. And when therefore he was come up again and had broken bread and eaten and talked a long while, even till the break of day, so he departed. And when they brought the young man alive, they were not a little comforted. And we went before to ship and sailed unto Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot. And when he had met with us at Assos, we took him in and came to Mytilene. And we sailed thence and came the next day over against Chios. And the next day we arrived at Samos and tarried at Troglium. And the next day we came to Miletus. For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus, because he would not spend time in Asia, for he had hastened that if it were possible to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Now that's a big reading. Now note, this is a night meeting on the first day of the week. It says, Paul preached unto them and continued his speech until midnight, and that there were many lights in the upper chamber needed at night. And in verse 11, it says, Paul talked long. He had even until the break of day. So not only did he preach until midnight, then he kept on talking to them all night. So this was all happening at night on the first day of the week. And according to the Jews, when does the night of the first day of the week begin? It begins at sunset, Saturday night, until midnight, and then continuing into Sunday morning. So this is the first day of the week. The Bible reckoning is the same. According to Bible reckoning, the first day of the week begins with the dark, with the night, with the evening. You read that in Genesis. The first day ever, the first Sunday ever, if you like, in Genesis 1 verse 5. When did it begin? Genesis 1 verse 5, and the day God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So we begin the day, and all the other days follow the same in that account. So the night, or the dark part of the day, is first, according to biblical reasoning, and also according to the Jews in the way they kept the Sabbath. And then the light part of the day follows after the dark part. So the time of darkness precedes the light part of Sunday. And so this is what we call Saturday night. This meeting was Saturday night they had. So Paul was preaching to the people at Troas on what we call Saturday night until midnight. And then he talked with them on Sunday morning till the break of day. And Paul preached to them, and he talked to them all night. But what did Paul do? Daybreak Sunday morning. Let's look what he did. What example does he give in Acts 20 verse 11? And when therefore he was come up again, he had broken bread, and he had eaten, and talked a long while, even till the break of day. So he departed. Apostle Paul departed the break of day, and he went on his journey, a long journey, Sunday morning. And verse 13 says, they also sailed. And wherefore we went before the ship and sailed unto Assos, intending to take Paul in, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot. So he was going to walk. He sent them all on ship, his companions. And Apostle Paul departed by foot, walking across the peninsula from Troas to Assos. You know that distance. It's 20 miles or 32 kilometers, I believe. Have you ever walked that far in a day? 32 kilometers in a day? That's no mean feat. That's a long walk. That's a long journey. How far is a Sabbath day's journey? How far for a law-keeping Jew? Luke was also traveling with Paul. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, the same author, the same book, tells us so far. We already read the verse in Acts chapter 1, verse 12. Remember? That was Luke. Luke was a Gentile, a Christian, and he recorded all of Paul's journeyings, and he knew how far a Sabbath day's journey was. He's written it here. And he knew. He says, then they returned unto Jerusalem, which from Mount Olivet, which is from Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. Luke recorded that in Acts chapter 1, verse 12. And so here in Acts chapter 20, he makes no comment about Apostle Paul. He makes no comment, Paul walking that huge distance on Sunday morning. It's interesting, isn't it? How far is the Olivet from Jerusalem? Well, it's not far. Not far. You know, a kilometre maybe a little bit more. Paul exceeded that distance by 31 kilometres. He exceeded the Sabbath day's journey by this incredible long distance. So if Paul's preaching on the evening of the first day of the week, if that imparted any sort of sanctity to Sunday, his travelling by foot all the light part of Sunday must have surely taken away any sanctity to that day. Him knowing the law, him. Paul not only walked from Troas to Assos on Sunday, what else did he do? He's commanded his companions to sail by ship, to travel by ship. Nothing a Jew would do. All 7 of them on the first day of the week, Paul appointed his companions here in verse 13. He appointed his companions, 7 of them, Luke, Timothy, Tychicus, Trophimus, Gaius, Aristarchus, Secundus. He appointed these that they should sail around the peninsula to Assos on the first day of the week, a distance of 65 kilometres if they sailed around there, sailing on Saturday night. And then while Paul was preaching all the night, and Paul appointed that they should travel on this night, all Saturday night, all daylight on Sunday, travelling by ship, night and day, because Paul wanted to meet them there by the time he got across the peninsula. He wanted to spend that extra time. He didn't have a lot of time. He wanted to preach to the people at Troas and send his companions on by ship. And then he preached all night and he talked all night. And then Sunday morning, he got up and he walked that 32 kilometers across and met them because he was in a hurry. Because it says here in the verses that Paul was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem before Pentecost. He wasn't going to wait around. And once Paul met them in that city over the peninsula, once he'd walked those distance, they sailed on to these other places, another island that says Mytilene, which is another 65 kilometre distance. All on the first day of the week. This is exactly how these Christians kept Sunday, so-called. by traveling, by working. They weren't resting. They were walking, they were traveling. They were not doing any resting. They were not keeping the day holy. They had no regard for it. They treated it as a common working day. So when people come to you and say, "Oh, Acts chapter 20, this is a reason for Sunday sacredness," you need to say, "No, it's not. It's not." Paul never authorized any change to a holy day, not by word, not by example. And neither did the Apostle John. He didn't as well. People read in Revelation 1 verse 10, they say the Lord's day, Revelation 1 verse 10. Here it says, an Apostle John, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice of a trumpet. The people like to claim this and say, this is Sunday, but there's nothing that says that. What day does the Lord claim as his? What day did Jesus claim as the Lord's day? In Mark 2, verse 27 and 28. Mark 2, verse 27 and 28. What day is claimed in Mark by the Lord himself here in these verses? Mark 2, verse 27 and 28. This is Jesus speaking, and he said unto them, the Sabbath was not made for man, let's read again. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man, which was Jesus, is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, in this scene, I haven't read all of that scene there in Mark, but Jesus and the Jewish leaders were there in conflict. They were arguing with Jesus about their Sabbath restrictions, which they wanted to impose. And Jesus was so obviously this was the Sabbath day, the seventh day they were arguing about. And Jesus was referring them to the beginning when God made the Sabbath for man's benefit in the Garden of Eden. And not just the Jews in general, for man, all mankind. And he said, I am Lord of the Sabbath. He is creator, the creator God who instituted that day in the first place. And he is Lord of that day. And in Revelation 22, verse 14, talks about John. There is a special blessing of those pronounced here. It says, John writes this. He says, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. John is saying, blessed are the people doing the commandments, including what? Including those who labor for 6 days. That's according to the 10 Commandments. To labor on those 6 common working days and to rest on the Sabbath according to the commandment. If we want that blessing at all. We know there was the attempt to change God's law. Man has attempted to change his law and to bring in this other day of worship, this alternate day. But this was never by the authority of God. It's only by the authority of man. And, oftentimes the authority of man never meets up to the authority of God. We see even in John chapter 7, the Gospel of John, Although the Pharisees taught the people to keep the Ten Commandments, they sometimes added extra rules, extra laws, and these are the traditions of men. And Jesus didn't accept these extra things. Here in John 7, verse 7, have I got the right verse? No, Mark, sorry. Wrong gospel. Mark chapter 7, verse 7. He says, howbeit in vain do they worship me. It's vain to worship God when you're following human tradition, because that's all it becomes. Teaching for the doctrines, the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the traditions of men, as the washing of pots and cups and many other such things ye do. So this was kind of the rules of the Pharisees to try and be holy, these extra washings that God never commanded. God commanded them to keep the seventh day holy, into rest, but he never commanded this extra washing, and that didn't really make them holy. I mean, it's nice to be hygienic, but it wasn't, it was the Ten Commandments. And then it goes on to say, and he said unto them, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. That's the trouble. That's the trouble when we make human laws and human things. It leads us to reject God's commandments and to lessen God's laws and God's rules and put human rules and human things instead. In the past, the pagans, they invented gods. They made gods of idols of wood and stone, and they worship these things. But these kind of religions, they were all human inventions. They made up their own religion. There was no God in it. It was all vain. They would pray to their gods of wood and stone, and no God would hear them. No God would answer them. No living God. They worship God in vain. And we read here the same with the traditions of men. They're vanity. They go nowhere. And according to the Bible, we have the example of the Apostle Paul. Sunday was a common working day to him. Men have made it their commandment. It's human tradition. Going back to the time of Constantine, that's the first one to make it a Sunday law. The emperor of Rome. But he was a man. There's no God in it. And if we want our prayers answered, we need to pray to a living God. We need to honor a living God. And we need to pray to the Creator God that made the seventh day Sabbath a memorial to his creative works. Otherwise, we have an empty religion. We want to have a living God who answers prayers in a living way. When I pray, I expect to hear an answer some way. And God works through providence, and I begin to see, how he's working in my life. We've had very specific answers to prayer. This is how you got to get to know God, the living God. Yeah. So, and by honoring his commandments and his holy day, the last test we have in this world, the test question we have, whether we will honor a living God or not. The test question we have is, whether we will keep this day holy or whether we will follow man and man's tradition. It's a test question, really. Who are we going to put first? A living God or man? This is a big test question for us in the last days. There's other tests that have come to us, other test questions perhaps. but things that are not important. We've had, other things come to us, but this is more important, and we need to make our stand for the truth, because in these last days, people are going against God's word, and they're putting the Ten Commandments down and not keeping them, or substituting man's laws. That's all I wanted to share really today. I hope you get a blessing from this speech today.